Welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, where we explore the intersection of Bitcoin and progressive issues. I'm your host, Mark Stefani. It's the top of the hour. We'll go ahead and get started. So, Abe, again, thank you so much for joining me on this Twitter Spaces. Your episode that we recorded for the Progressive Bitcoiner actually has some of the highest number of listeners of all the episodes that I've done. And so clearly what you have to say in the space is deeply respected. And so again, I thank you for your time and ability to share again with our people tuning into spaces about your background. So thank you.
No, it's no problem at all. I said it's my pleasure to talk about this kind of stuff. It's why I'm here. Let's thank you for having me back, and hello everyone, and hello to all your listeners.
Thank you. So for those the people that are tuning in, who have not listened to the episode, if you don't mind, give us a bit of a background with regard to your professional and academic history. That'd be great, as well as how that transitioned to the Sun Exchange.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess without going back too far back in my life, my academic background is I actually studied physical geography back at my undergrad, and I really took an interest and ended up specializing in paleoclimatology, i.e. the study of very old climatic systems of the planet, the work over the course of eons, and how the planet's the Earth's climate has changed over the billions of years. And I found it very fascinating. And then when you start looking at how human activity in a very short space of time is disrupting or causing uncontrolled, we are conducting uncontrolled experiments on systems which we're only just beginning to understand how they interact. Was a cause of concern for me amongst other people in the world. So I ended up applying to do a Master's of Science degree studying the science of climate change at University of East Anglia in the UK back in 2007, which I did under a scholarship from the National Environmental Research Council. After about the first term, semester, to put it into American, of studying the science of climate change, I realized that actually it's kind of pointless studying to increase our precision of understanding an issue which is obviously profound and extremely hazardous to human survival. So I ended up specializing in or doing further studies into environmental impact assessment and environmental management systems, i.e. how can we make businesses less harmful to the environment? And as I got into those topics, I realized that it's energy use that is the impact of the environment. So let alone waste management or water consumption, it's energy consumption, which is the biggest impact to environments of all business and organizations, and as individuals as well. I mean, everything fundamentally breaks down to energy. So I ended up doing my dissertation to do a feasibility study to solar power a hospital in the UK back in 2007. And the results of that study were that solar powering a hospital in England, of all places, was about to become commercially viable. And this was before there were any real subsidies in place in the UK. So I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. This is definitely the future. I'm going to hand my studies in early, get it all done out the way. And I went and got a job as a solar panel installer in 2008 in the UK. The first thing I ever did in the solar energy industry was strip a roof of concrete tiles and install a solar tile system. The product that Tesla announced or released a couple of years ago, I was installing 14 years ago. To put in perspective of like how far in advance of the solar industry this was at the time. And I set up a solar installation company, which I ran for about 4 or 5 years. I set it up as a workers' co-op, a cooperative. And by nature of setting up a cooperative business, there's a certain amount of ethics and philosophy around cooperative businesses, which I still hold very dear. and in some respects are very carrying the same principles that cryptocurrency carry. So open membership and economic participation, maybe not so akin to Bitcoin, but concern for the community and education are all very key features of a cooperative business model. And running a solar installation company as a cooperative, I tended to be gravitated towards cooperative financing structures for solar projects. So we championed a project called Streets of Solar in the city of Bristol in the UK. And this is in a very underprivileged area of the city of Bristol. And there were streets of houses that would never be able to afford solar panels for their homes unless it was done as a community cooperative where the individuals that can afford to participate in those projects can put money into a cooperative, which then pays for the solar panels to be installed on the houses. And the houses then benefit from lower cost energy, and the revenues that the solar panels produce are returned to the cooperative members. We did this a few times in the UK. It's one of the most common ways for solar projects to actually get funded, especially in Germany. The majority of solar projects, in fact, are funded as cooperatives, but they are quite bureaucratic and they're quite time consuming to set up. But that's how the kind of projects that we're going to involve with. Now, all along, bearing in mind, this is 2009 now, Bitcoin is there. We're at the height of the global recession, or the very beginnings of what was then a major global recession, and Bitcoin had started. And I'm following this technology in parallel to watching the solar sector unfurl itself and evolve, which I thought was quite interesting. And I was following Bitcoin technology and the price of Bitcoin, but it wasn't until I moved to South Africa where these two interests of mine came into being. Now, I moved to South Africa in 2014 to work as a solar energy consultant because I realized that the future for the solar energy industry is not in the UK. Let's get that clear. Like, solar panels in the UK are not the most effective. Yes, energy costs are very high, so economically it does work, but really from a kind of an environmental perspective and just practically, solar panels need to be going where there is lots of sun. And South Africa drew me in. I was very much drawn to South Africa, but it was entirely by accident that I ended up being here. But once I was here, I felt like this is the place for me to be. As I flew into South Africa for the first time, I looked out the window of the plane and I saw no solar panels on the roofs, zero. And this is a country that's being basked in sunshine with a decrepit, falling apart, coal-powered energy grid. And yet there was no solar panels on the roofs. And I'm coming into the country to work as a solar energy consultant. So something was amiss, I noticed as I was coming in. And after just literally a couple of months, I realized that what was going on in South Africa is that there was no finance available. There was no financial products available to enable schools and factories and retirement homes to go solar. And the industry was so immature that lenders were not really looking to lend money into what's a fairly non-existent market and industry. And the government of South Africa, the least of their concerns is subsidizing clean energy when there's 70% youth unemployment and HIV pandemics or endemics, sort of crime, serious social issues. That subsidizing clean energy is the least of their concerns. Or one of the lower priorities anyway, at least at the time, bear in mind 2014. So the other thing that I noticed from arriving in South Africa is the payments systems, like the banking systems, are pretty advanced for Africa, but archaic when it comes to sort of retail banking. And to put this into perspective, I wanted to send a payment back to the UK from South Africa, and I literally had to fill in forms with pen and paper and then queue up on my lunch break to hand this form over to the counter, which they then entered into a computer, and then had to send money overseas. Took about 5 days. And I realized at that point that this is what Bitcoin was created for, was to be able to send payments overseas quickly and instantly. So I did an experiment with my friend who was living in London. He was actually programming in Bitcoin back in the early days, I bought my first Bitcoin, fractions of Bitcoins, probably like maybe zero point 0.1 Bitcoin at the time, and sent it to my friend, and he sent it back to me. It arrived back in my wallet 20 minutes later, almost the exact same amount I sent, and I was like, holy smokes. So I was going to say something worse than holy smokes. This is an amazing technology. I mean, how that's incredible is that I can send a payment from one side of the planet to the other instantly, from one wallet to another, like sending an email. That is an incredible technology. And then after like a few weeks of pondering this, like the penny dropped that by combining this global peer-to-peer payment system with the concept of remote ownership of solar panels, you can now solve this issue of people around the world wanting to own solar panels and wanting to invest into solar, but not necessarily being able to do so if they don't own their own home, or don't necessarily know what company to invest in the stock market in the solar industry. They can now just buy solar panels online and lease them to a solar project on the other side of the world. And Bitcoin is the financial system that enabled that. And that was the kind of the catalyst, the first spark of realizing what the Sun Exchange could be, and that brings us to October 2014. So that gives you the background in Sun Exchange, and that gives you my academic background, and that was a very long answer, and I hope that was interesting.
Oh, absolutely it is, and I appreciate you sharing that. So walk us through how Sun Exchange works. And I'm also kind of curious to know, have there been iterations of the user end process over the years, and how has that evolved to what it is now?
Yeah, I mean, the very first idea I had of Sun Exchange was around some kind of peer-to-peer lending model. But that wasn't going to work because of the myriad complicated different financial regulations that are around lending and loans and financial structures and financial services, etc. So I had to find a model that wasn't really a financial product, that was just around actual direct ownership of solar panels. So the first project I actually did in South Africa was our pilot project back in 2016. I did actually, having said all that about cooperatives and how archaic they are and slow, I actually did that as a cooperative. So I did the first project as a solar cooperative called the Stellenbosch Waldorf School Cooperative. But nevertheless, even though it was structured as a cooperative, it was still the project where the world's first, or at least I've yet to find anyone dispute this claim, that it was the first time that Bitcoin had ever been invested into solar panels. So the genesis block of what I'd like to call the tipping point of the silicon age, solar powered money, as I'd like to call it. And I can go into more detail around the kind of the macro view of what that looks like. But that was the first time that Bitcoin had ever invested into a solar project. And the first time that Bitcoin had ever been earned from generating solar power. And that was in March 2016. That was done when the Sun Exchange website was literally just a holding page for a PDF document, which people filled in and sent back to me. That was like the first iteration. That was literally our minimum viable product, which is proving that individuals around the world want to basically earn Bitcoin from solar powering schools in Africa. That MVP I submitted to the Consensus Conference, which is, I think it's run by CoinDesk. They allowed me to present on stage in Manhattan in around May 2016 to show what I'd done. And it picked up the attention of Adam Draper from Boost VC in San Mateo, California. And he invited me to come down to San Francisco and pitch to him on their pitch podcast called Pitch FM. So I did that. So it's funny how one thing leads to another. And then so I pitched to him, gave him a 60-second pitch. I walked out of the room. They discussed the pitch they just heard, and you walk back in and they tell you if they've invested or not. They like a mini Shark Tank or Dragon's Den if you're in the UK. And it turns out that they did. They wanted to invest $60,000 into Sun Exchange to get it catalyzed because it's just the perfect use case of Bitcoin in their exact words. And it was actually the first company that ever agreed to invest into on Pitch FM. So that's another accolade to the Sun Exchange's history. And that initial money allowed me to actually then nail down what the model could be. And I got lawyers' legal advice on how the structure could be about micro ownership and deed of title over an asset. And I started to build a team around me and start to really flesh out the architecture of the Sun Exchange platform. And that platform has just continued to evolve to where it is today.
Now, you had a token at one point, and I'm curious to know why you chose to abandon it.
It's not abandoned. We were just way ahead of the curve on what is possible with a token. I'll get into it in a later, but I mean, even the token itself went through a couple of iterations before we basically had to compromise on one form of the SunX token. But I just want to just point out that the core of Bitcoin the core of Sun Exchange is the Bitcoin payment network. I mean, we are using Bitcoin as a universal payment rail. That's all Bitcoin was ever intended to be, peer-to-peer online digital money. That's what it is. That's what it was invented for, and that's what we use it for. It just so happens that we do host wallets for our members so they can accumulate that Bitcoin in a wallet. And they can, so people don't necessarily need to set up their own wallet. We host them a hot wallet where they can accumulate their earnings until such time that they want to withdraw it to their own wallet or redeploy that Bitcoin into buying more solar panels. So that is the absolute core of Sun Exchange. Now, the aspect that is to be considered here is that when you buy a solar panel, even for your own house, right? If you want to buy solar panels for your house, that's a 25-year commitment because you've bought solar panels. You can't go back to the person that sold you the solar panels a couple of years later and say, this $10,000 worth of solar panels, I want to sell $100 of them back to you. Your solar panel installer is not going to do that. You're locked in. And likewise, buying solar panels through Sun Exchange is that. You're literally buying solar panels online, which are being installed onto a roof elsewhere in the world. So you're basically locked in for 20 years when you buy solar panels through Sun Exchange. The step beyond that, though, is to create a digital asset of each solar cell so that the digital asset represents the ownership of that solar panel or solar cell, and whoever holds that digital asset has rights to the financial yield attached to that solar cell. Now, the only issue with that is that then becomes a security token. And when we proposed this back in 2017, the regulations were nowhere near ready on actually where that should be being done. And also the technology behind, or even the blockchain around which, how to have that kind of level of small value digital asset. Ethereum was really at the time the only option. And the gas fees were at that point getting ludicrous. Looking at $100 a transaction in some instances with Ethereum. So it really basically realized that we were ahead of the curve. There's no way of doing that then and there. So we needed to find we wanted to still do something to create our own ecosystem token. So we created SunX token, which was a rewards program for our platform. So allow people to accumulate SunX tokens. It's basically like air miles and rewards for the platform. And that's kind of where we ended up going with that. But the ultimate aspiration is still to have a tradable digital asset behind a solar cell. And that's what we are now. I'm looking at over the next 12 to 18 months is actually nailing down how that can work. So that gives you an explanation of where that fits into our plan and why we took certain directions as and when.
Are you able to elaborate on what you just referred to, your plans for over the next 12 to 18 months and how the security fits into there?
Well, it's about finding the right jurisdiction to do it from. I understand that there are now a couple of jurisdictions in the world that now acknowledge and allow for issuance of that. There may be limitations as to who can own them and how they're sold, but that's basically what we're exploring. And that's my goal over the next 12 months is we now know that it is possible to have such a security token. It's just how do we do that and how do they get converted and what changes would we need to make to where even the domicile of where the issuance is being done from. That's currently being explored, and may not even be possible. Let's get that straight. It may not even be possible technically or even legally to do what that vision is a tradable solar cell with financial yield attached to it. May not even possible yet, but it's something I'm definitely determined to explore.
So it seems like almost every couple of weeks, getting emails about a new project, a new crowdfunding project. So I'm curious to know, how are you going after some of these new crowd sale projects? Are they mostly approaching you, or are you finding that the barrier is just awareness of the Sun Exchange? And once they find out about what you're offering, a lot of these communities and businesses are quick to sign up.
So, I mean, when I first started, we had to look for the projects. The first project that we did, Stellenbosch Waldorf School, I approached them because I met one of the teachers and I explained to him what we're trying to do. He loved the idea and he introduced me to the management of the school, who in turn introduced me to their landlords, who then, which is a quite progressive wine estate called Spier here in Cape Town. So they kind of gave me the blessing to do the first project, but that was a school, and schools are very important to me to do as a first project, because schools, like of any organisation, are the types of organisation are least likely to have money on hand to invest into a solar power plant. And even if they did, that money is better off being invested into education, more educational materials, there'd be some pay increase for their staff, whatever it is, new sports facilities. And then you have like the behavioural impact of having kids being exposed to solar power of their school. And more to the point, Sun Exchange is open to everyone. So kids in that school literally own solar cells powering their own education and are accumulating Bitcoin as a result. And I know for a fact there's kids that have grown up now since 2016. So over the last 6 years, they've been accumulating Bitcoin in a wallet whilst powering their own education. You can't tell me that, if anything, that's not pretty profound. There's a lot going on there, especially in terms of like psychology of a kid accumulating income from powering their own education. So that means that idea, that concept, resonated with a lot of headmasters and principals of schools, and we got a lot of publicity. We've got on local news and press and media, and so we started getting approached by schools wanting to go solar. But we're not just about schools, but most of our projects are schools. So that's really how we're now having schools come to us to go solar. But there are other industry verticals that we want to also help get solar powered. So retirement homes, these are buildings which house people all year round, and are only going to become more and more populated over time as populations age. So it's very important for us to address energy security and lower energy costs to those. And schools for skills. I mean, we're just talking about standard schools, normal education, but things like schools for skills. So these are the kind of facilities which train people for vocational training, like how to become a chef, how to become a welder, and anything that requires that kind of manual skill. Those kind of schools are so sensitive to power outages. And South Africa is becoming really, really hurt by power cuts, like rolling power cuts, because the national grid is so harmed. And we can now we are now putting in solar and storage systems, so battery systems into our solar plants to prevent power cuts from causing disruption to that kind of operation. So the project we've got open right now is one of those projects. And it's such a fantastic product for that organization that they tell other organizations about it. So that's kind of where the word of mouth kicks in. Another great example of a kind of project where word of mouth gets out is in agriculture. So most farmers know their neighboring farms, and we've just solar, in fact, approaching the very final stages of completion of our first completely off-grid solar project. So this is where the solar plant is not connected to the national grid at all. It's complete standalone. And that's for a farm called Karoo Fresh, who grow broccoli and saffron, and other high value vegetables and herbs. And that's a completely off-grid solar plant, and it's replacing diesel generators. So that farmer no longer has to buy diesel, which is expensive, polluting, and impractical to move diesel around. And now they've got a complete standalone solar and storage system. So that farmer is now telling his farmer friends about it, and we got into agricultural press about it. And that's really how our name gets out there. So as we go into each vertical, we've got to kind of establish a name for ourselves, because we tap into the exact needs of that sector. And then we will address other sectors that also need energy. So one key area or key vertical I'd love to get into is ecotourism. So there are lots of, tourism is one of the most important sectors, especially in Africa. It brings so much foreign money in, so important for stimulating economic growth. And things like lodges in remote areas, they're still running diesel generators so that people can have a luxurious holiday in remote locations. But that requires diesel energy, diesel fuel, usually being ported to sensitive ecosystems. So getting standalone solar and storage system into that is absolutely vital. And that's an area that I want to see more of those types of projects through Sun Exchange.
I think one of the questions that was most talked about following our podcast together was your discussion of a clean energy transition in developing regions of the world, in particular, kind of the global south. And I'm hoping to, for you to kind of expand on your thoughts there, and in addition, get your kind of opinion on some of the projects that recently came to light in my world, and specifically just reading about this Morocco UK project where they're dropping cables from a Morocco solar farm all the way to the UK to supply 3.6 gigawatts of solar energy from Morocco to the UK. And I look at that and I think, that's, arguably a reasonable thing to do for the UK. And we applaud that in the West and in the EU. But this clean energy transition, we cannot forget about everybody else who does not have that capability to pay for such technology. It begs the question, what about the people of Morocco and their clean energy transition? How are you viewing this discussion in light of your expertise in solar energy, as well as your interest in Bitcoin?
It's fascinating seeing that kind of project emerge from Morocco. I've been to Morocco. I went there as actually part of my geography field trip as part of my degree. Absolutely beautiful country, and I highly recommend anyone to go if you have the opportunity. But nevertheless, it's a good example of where that's like mega infrastructure projects, and there are means and skills to do that. And you're dispatching energy via high voltage DC into the UK, which is already set up to accept energy of that in that volume, because there's other interconnections around the UK. There's an interconnection into Norway for excess hydro. There's an interconnection to France for getting excess nuclear or dumping surplus wind power. I mean, there's basically a high voltage DC supergrid being developed around Europe, which is amazing, because that's the one thing about renewables is if you've got a surplus, you need to be able to put it somewhere, otherwise it's a waste. So interconnecting is very important. But that is still in the global north. I mean, Morocco is in Africa, yes, but it's definitely not sub-Saharan Africa. It's by very definition North Africa, and it's bordering Europe. So there is that money right on the doorstep to fund that kind of project. But when you go into, I think I'm going to say proper Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa, that's when issues start to come up, because the grid in most sub-Saharan African countries doesn't even exist properly. It's not even there to do anything with. But that gives you with an opportunity to actually work from a clean slate. You're literally working from the ground up, and you can use the latest technology to deliver energy without having to go through the traditional steps of building large thermal power station and build transmission distribution lines to get that energy to energy consumers in rural areas. That's how electricity systems grew and have developed traditionally. The only problem with that is that it takes an enormous amount of capital, and it also takes an enormous amount of time. And as a result, you're also relying on thermal power stations, which the majority of which in the world come from fossil fuels. There's a couple of geothermal power stations in Kenya, but that's a very exceptional case. And so really that leaves the most of Africa without energy access, because it takes so much time to connect and so much money. And that leads to energy poverty, and also leads to people living in rural areas to give up their livelihoods and their communities to move to cities where there is energy available. And that results in urban sprawl and this kind of slums or favelas, if you're in Latin America, or informal settlements and townships which surround most African cities, because people are trying to get access to modern day services. But that's not necessary when it comes to solar power now, because you can deploy a solar power plant into a remote location very quickly, very easily, and deliver grid utility quality energy at the last mile at a price which is affordable to people living in those communities. So that is a really interesting technological leap which it can be taken there. And you can also kind of akin that to the role of cryptocurrency in countries across Africa, where people who have not had access to financial services or digital banking now can all access cryptocurrency wallets without having to go through all those other steps of getting a bank account and getting a debit card and all those kind of things, those steps that we've gone through over 100 years of financial service evolution. They can go straight to the latest technology of getting access to Bitcoin immediately when they've got data. And you can have data in a rural area because you've got energy systems from solar energy. Starlink is now an amazing way for people to be able to access data remotely from anywhere in the world, for example. So this kind of this access to the latest technology, or even open source technology, which I like to call it, I do consider solar power to be open source energy, is now the least expensive way for people to get energy. So I do think that's a really interesting thing to consider when you look at Africa and other emerging markets that has yet to develop its energy systems can access the latest and greatest, which is very important because most regions of Africa are bearing the brunt of climate change faster and harder than most developed countries. There are more sensitive areas, drought. If you haven't got adequate water pumping and facilities, then drought hurts. If you look at the drought maps of across Africa, it's scary. But accessing solar energy means you can now start to drill boreholes and access groundwater without having to rely on rainfall. So getting access to energy is absolutely important, and it will help countries cope with further impacts of climate change.
So I've invited a few of you up as speakers. If you have questions, feel free to hop up. Otherwise, for any of you in the audience, please start submitting your questions for Abe. And in the meantime, you're in the intersection here between solar energy, climate change, fighting against climate change and the forces that behind that, and obviously a long duration of interest in Bitcoin and its impacts. How are you talking to people, both from the lay side as well as professionally, regarding Bitcoin mining and its concerns for energy consumption, its climate footprint?
So first I want to just touch on what the traditional banking system and traditional money for me represents. The reality is that traditional banks, especially banks like the Royal Bank of Scotland in the UK, they basically fund the exploration of fossil fuels, and they are subsidized by the government. They give them enormous tax breaks, both at home and abroad, to go and identify, access, exploit fossil fuel resources. That's how they make the majority of their money. HSBC in the UK funded the XL pipeline across the United States, and that's a UK bank. So basically, for me, the traditional financial system and the traditional energy fossil fuel world are basically in bed with each other. They are bedfellows, and which I think is quite interesting when you look at what the kind of the macroeconomics of those two sectors, because the traditional finance system is based on this principle that you can just continue to print money freely as and when you want to create artificial economic stimulus. You could just print money, flood the US market with new fresh dollars. I think it's like $3 trillion now more in circulation, but more dollars have been released in the last couple of years than has ever existed in history. I think that's a correct fact. Someone can please check that for me. But the principle is the same. And so basically, you've got this infinite source of money, which causes money to lose value over time. Now, when you look at the traditional energy sector, which is sourcing fossil fuels, that is a finite energy source. And the more people use it, the more scarce it becomes and the more expensive it's going to be. So now, without looking at renewables and Bitcoin, if you stay in that world of fiat money and fossil fuels, your money's going to become worth less over time, and your energy to become more expensive. So there's only one direction that's facing, and that's global energy poverty and climate change. So the antidote to this, as created by Satoshi, was a deflationary currency that's scarce and becomes more valuable over time. So the buying power, the purchasing power of that crypto increases over time, and it can be created on silicon chips. It is created on silicon chips. It's just a solid state money that's digital and doesn't need to have a physical form. Which, if you could even think about gold reserves, like gold, to dig gold out the ground takes enormous amounts of money, of energy and money. I did actually, one of the first things I did in South Africa was do a feasibility study on how to solar power a gold mine. And I looked at how much energy was actually used to create gold. And it's enormous. Like it's beyond what the traditional finance system uses more energy than the Bitcoin network, put it that way. And people don't take that into account when they're looking at what the alternative to Bitcoin is. Now, the other kind of advantage of Bitcoin is because it's one network, it's one integrated system, it's quite easy to improve the efficiency of it. And the beauty of it is that solar energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper, because again, it's a silicon chip. It's a solid state energy source. It's basically quantum physics in physical form. And it's getting cheaper and cheaper. The more people use solar power, the cheaper the energy becomes. So now when you kind of merge those two technologies, so cryptocurrency mining with solar energy, the currencies you're mining are becoming more and more valuable over time, and the energy you're getting it from is becoming cheaper and cheaper over time, which is the direct opposite of the system it's replacing, which is energy that's becoming more and more expensive and money becoming worth less and less. So that is this tipping point. And it's all based on silicon. That's literally a silicon-powered economy. Then you've got silicon chips financing and powering silicon chips, and that is this transition which I can see is taking place. And the beauty of it also is that if your mining of crypto is from a renewable powered source, it's irrelevant of how much energy it takes, because there's no environmental impact of continuing to run that energy system. Beyond the manufacturing of the solar panels themselves, which in itself is becoming less and less environmentally harmful as we're getting better at using less materials to make solar panels and recycle solar panels and make solar panels from renewable energy. So this whole system now becomes clean and self-reinforcing and self-sustainable, which is ultimately all we're trying to achieve here on this planet, is to become self-sustainable. So we're not going to kill ourselves from destroying the planet, and actually just create a system that can create abundance and can allow us to live healthy, long, enriched lives. And that's only possible when our money has value and when we're not reliant on a financial system which is causing that addiction to energy, addiction to fossil fuels. So that for me is this philosophical and technological shift, which for me is what this is all about, transitioning to decentralized energy, decentralized money, is the solution away from reliant on a broken system.
How do we aid that transition? Again, this gets back to my previous question, to the global south, to smaller communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Do they bring models like yours, or do you see smaller solar projects paired with batteries and Bitcoin mining? How do you see that transition playing out?
So, I mean, Bitcoin mining is a really great dump load for surplus energy. So when you have an off-grid solar power plant that's basically some solar panels and a battery pack, and that system has been designed to deliver a certain amount of energy. Now, if your batteries are full and there's no further load on there's no further drain on the battery, and your solar plant can still produce electricity, then right now, without a dump load, i.e., somewhere to put that surplus, you've lost that energy. Your solar plant just has its throttles down. The inverter regulates the power output, and you've basically lost that energy. So equipping a microgrid with Bitcoin mining hardware is such a beautifully elegant solution. And you can speak to anyone, any developer of a mini grid or a microgrid, especially for rural electrification. Having an anchor tenant, having an energy consumer that will pay their bill is the biggest challenge. Most of these guys rely on telecoms operators with a mobile mast. That's their anchor tenant. But mobile masts in these areas don't actually use that much electricity. So to be able to put a Bitcoin mining rig in a rural, remote location that will just absorb surplus energy and convert it into money on the spot, that's amazing. And it's something which is going to start to materialize. I've been speaking to lots of mini grid developers and talking about how this can be implemented. And it's just a matter of time before it becomes standard, fitting mini grids with Bitcoin mining hardware. It's certainly something which we're looking to do, and I'd love to see happen and equipped most of our solar plants is Bitcoin mining hardware. For me, it just makes sense. It's just a matter of finding the right technology that's reliable and the right hardware that's reliable and requires the least amount of maintenance. And I think that's ultimately the challenge there. Ultimately comes down to how do you maintain the systems? How do you make sure there's no equipment failures? I guess that just comes also down to skills training and making sure that people who are in remote areas are adequately trained and giving them skills which will serve them well as we go further into the 21st century.
It was a beautiful sentiment, Abe. Thank you. I want to encourage people to ask questions. You can hit the little bubble in the bottom right corner of the app, or raise your hand, and you can be a speaker if you have any questions. Abe, where's the Sun Exchange in 5-10 years from now?
Well, I mean 5 years ago, Sun Exchange had basically just done its first solar project, 15 kilowatts. And 5 years on, 6 years on, we've done 63 solar plants with 10 megawatts. So that's quite a step. That's basically gone from 15 kilowatts to 1,000 kilowatts. No, 10,000 kilowatts. Was that 100,000 kilowatts? Sorry, I'm trying to do mental math in my head. 100,000 kilowatts in the space of 5 years. So if on that rate of growth, I'd love to be hitting a gigawatt of solar installations in the next 5 years. A gigawatt would be about the power output of a pretty major sized nuclear power station. But when you put that into the African context, I mean, some African countries' energy grids in total, we have already surpassed in terms of energy production. So it's what seems like a small amount of energy from a US perspective is actually a major overhaul or huge change to the makeup of an African nation's energy production. So I'd love to be able to see actually transform whole nations into solar power hubs throughout the African continent and further abroad. So I'd love to see us doing projects in Latin America and Southeast Asia. I know that the problems and challenges of access to finance and energy issues, energy access issues, are not just an African problem. It's also a Latin American issue. It's an issue facing thousands of islands in Indonesia and Philippines. They're running diesel generators and in pristine ecosystems, huge cost. And that's the kind of regions where we can also bring our solution Sun Exchange was always intended to be the global platform for businesses and organizations from all walks of life to be able to access energy. And likewise, just continue to grow our community. Now, one thing that we have noticed and identified is that, yes, there are millions of individuals around the world that want to be doing this and earning from generating power to offset their carbon footprint or to have an extra income. But what we're really now seeing is for businesses and corporations to step up and put their money where their mouth is, and to put serious money into helping other businesses and countries transition to clean energy. So we're starting to see businesses now sign up to Sun Exchange, who can put in much larger sums of money than an individual could. And because they're a corporation, they can actually claim back, especially if in South Africa at least, you can claim back that purchase price of buying solar panels as an accelerated depreciation allowance, allowing them to claim back the purchase against the tax bill, whilst then still retaining the income from the solar panel they just bought. Because big corporations have to pay tax, and that's a tax allowance available to them. So that's something which we're very keen is to introduce what we are doing to businesses that want to start offsetting their or at least reducing the global CO2 emissions, whilst also enabling schools and retirement homes to reduce their energy costs. And it makes great financial sense for them. We're love to start speaking to organizations about how they can offer it to their employees as some form of retirement alternative, retirement fund alternative, so people can buying solar cells on behalf of their employees. That's something which I'd love to see how we can get a structure to set up for that. So I mean that's what that's where the ways we can see us moving. I also do think that the infrastructure that we've built and the architecture of our platform can be used in other verticals with the right in the right regulatory environment. So if we can nail down the be able to issue digital tokens, digital assets, we would be able to move into other verticals. So we could start to create a fractionalized vertical farm, for example, would be a use case for that. That's something that is in the far distant future, but perfectly within the realms of possibility. I thought of something which I didn't touch on there, which is around Bitcoin mining, and the fact that most Bitcoin mining around the world is, as far as I can tell now, getting to become more renewable energy powered, and I've already touched on this. The cost of renewables is now, solar and wind is now the cheapest form of energy for most people, most places on Earth. So it's kind of inevitable that Bitcoin mining will become renewable energy powered. But even so, one thing that people fail to take into account is that the majority of Bitcoin that has ever been mined was done on the CPUs back in the very early days. So that the value of all Bitcoin is the same. Now, the purchasing power of Bitcoin today can buy you 30 kilowatts of solar panels with one Bitcoin. And yes, mining one Bitcoin today uses a lot of energy. We're talking a house with energy usage for 70 years. But 30 kilowatts of solar panels is going to produce way more than the energy that house is ever going to use. So I think my point is that when you put Bitcoin to work and you invest a small amount of Bitcoin into solar power, that's actually a carbon sink, because you're going to reduce more carbon from buying those solar panels than it took to create that Bitcoin in the first place. We're starting to draft a white paper at the moment. We started to crunch the numbers on it, and it's looking like there's a compelling argument that if Bitcoin miners were just to dedicate a small percentage of Bitcoin that's mined, you are literally carbon neutralizing the whole network. And I believe there are some organizations that are set up to try and establish a kind of accreditation system. I believe there's an organization called the Bitcoin Clean Energy Initiative, which is there to enable, or basically to encourage Bitcoin miners to do such thing. One of the head ex-product directors at Google is actually behind one such organization. So there is a movement, there is a realization that Bitcoin doesn't necessarily need to be this dirty industry. Actually, it can be used to clean up and stabilize grids, help deploy mini grids, and also become self-sustainable and cleaning in its energy history and reducing carbon emissions globally in the long term.
Thank you. Looks like Troy joined us. I think you wanted to dovetail off of that comment that you made. Abe, Troy, did you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the math that you suggested, and I want to hear more about that accounting, because I guess I have a similar scheme, and my accounting scheme is basically that holders of Bitcoin can be carbon neutral if they do the same percentage of mining as they hold of Bitcoin. So if you hold X percent of Bitcoin, do X percent of all mining. And I'm just curious. I can't figure out exactly how your scheme works for mining. Just wonder if you could run through it real quickly.
Yeah, I mean, don't forget something. How for the benefit of everyone on the call that's maybe not looking at this in detail, just remind everyone how Bitcoin mining works. So you've got these computers around the world. They're all hashing away, basically processing or comparing numbers, and one of those miners will be rewarded with, currently I think it's 6.25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes there's just over $100,000 worth of Bitcoin issued to one of the miners in the network. But all of those miners are having to run computational hardware in order to try and compete for that Bitcoin, and all of those computers are using energy. And that energy footprint is huge, but it's only in the last couple of years where that energy footprint is of any real major significance. But every transaction that's done on the Bitcoin blockchain in that 10-minute period basically was used a fraction of that energy that was used. So every time you send and receive a Bitcoin, there is an energy footprint to that, because it's basically the number of transactions that occurred in that 10 minutes divided by the amount of energy that was consumed by the network in that 10-minute period. The all Bitcoins in circulation since day one have the same value, and the majority of Bitcoins that were mined with CPUs, and CPUs use almost next to zero energy. So what I'm suggesting is that if you were to take a small amount of Bitcoin now and invest into solar, the amount of carbon reduction you're going to get from buying solar panels that are deployed into a place like South Africa, where you're eliminating really dirty coal energy. Like South Africa's got one of the filthiest energy mixes of the world. They've got the lowest grade coal because all the good stuff is sold to the Chinese. So the fact is that South Africa's energy mix is filthy, and putting solar energy into South Africa, you are literally offsetting over 1 kilogram of CO2 for every kilowatt hour produced. And that's with a solar panel that was funded using cryptocurrency, the value of which is entirely artificial, as in we have created the value of Bitcoin in our minds, and there's no limit to what that value could be. But all Bitcoin have the same value, and that's really kind of what I'm trying to say. And we've crunched the numbers, and we've looked at the number of Bitcoin transactions that have occurred, throughout our network, and the energy footprint of the Bitcoin network in total. And we've crunched the numbers, and we think that it's more like 300 times carbon reduction for that's possible by spending Bitcoin on solar and sun exchange.
So I think I've got it now. So your thought is that, because Bitcoin is fungible, the carbon footprint of a Bitcoin is the same, and it's the average carbon footprint of all Bitcoin because of fungibility. And then when you look at investing in solar, you can see how you can offset that average pretty easily, because the average is actually very low, given that it's the energy intensive production has only happened at the tail end of Bitcoin.
That's right. Exactly. History. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. And then the value of that Bitcoin is so vastly much higher than it once was as well.
Right.
That the amount of work that can be done from that value of Bitcoin That's the thing to then look at, is actually what work could be done from a solar panel or 30 kilowatts of solar panels funded with 1 Bitcoin. But that Bitcoin still exists, mine. So that circulation of money and the velocity of money actually increases the value of Bitcoin. The more Bitcoin circulates, the better for everyone.
Right. I have a slightly different method of accounting. I won't bring it up here, but I would love to talk to you about it at some point. But I think it'll support a very, very similar conclusion, but it's also a non-trivially different method of accounting. But yeah, support the same conclusion.
Well, please DM me, and
I will.
Let's connect and circle back offline. Online, and I'll share with you the spreadsheet that our analyst has put together. I'd love you to rip it apart, poke some holes in it, and see if you can disprove what we've shown, because that's ultimately how science works.
Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Troy. Brian, are you there?
Am I here?
You are.
Yes, you are here, Brian.
Okay.
We hope you're here.
I had to hop in the car. I had to hop in the car, so I'm on my headset right now. So I wasn't never sure if that thing works for me or not. Hey, first of all, I want to say I do encourage you to connect with Troy. He has motivated me to look into a couple of other projects that are mining with hydro. And his method of accounting is fascinating, and it's really something I wish that we would hear more about in the Bitcoin space. I think those are important conversations just generally, but especially important for people who have environmental concerns, like I think a lot of us do. And actually, I really am curious. I know that there are several hydro opportunities. Central African Republic is the place that's talked a lot about trying to build on it. Do you have plans to expand outside of South Africa? I apologize, I did get off for a little while, so you maybe answered this and I missed it. But
well, the biggest project we've done to date is in Zimbabwe, and we've got plenty of projects in the pipeline further north in other African nations. I can't really divulge which ones they are because none of them are absolutely firmed up, but we do have absolute aspirations to be putting solar projects across the whole of the African continent as soon as you possibly can. We just got to make sure that we've absolutely nailed our way of working and the whole model down in South Africa. One thing I will point out is that, just to kind of put into perspective how far more advanced the South African economy is compared to other African nations, South Africa still produces about 70% of sub-Saharan Africa's energy. And there's something like well over 40 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and over 70% of the energy across all of those countries is produced in South Africa. So if we can solve South Africa's energy problem, you've made a good head start on addressing the sub-Saharan Africa's energy needs. And I have a strong aversion to large-scale hydro projects, especially in Africa. As we've seen on the River Nile, you can basically disrupt whole nations' farming and irrigation practices by damming the rivers higher upstream. It can cause huge civil issues. It can cause famine, a lot of geopolitical risk as a result. So I'm not an advocate at all of large-scale hydro. I think it's dangerous. If anyone's seen the original Superman movies, you can explode a dam and it's going to cause issues. And that's not to mention, the fish migratory patterns, and fish swim upriver to have babies, and you dam that river, you're basically stopping whole fish ecosystems from evolving and developing, which is a huge source of protein for millions, if not billions, of people. So I'm against large-scale hydro, if I've made that clear.
No, actually, I think that really is a good point. I know an issue in a lot of countries right now is that they actually already have the hydro capacity. They just don't have any use for the power right now. So, Bitcoin miners could help fund other things. It happens many, many years ago. I lived just downstream from a hydro dam on the Colinton River in Sierra Leone in West Africa. they ran electricity to 6 houses and then ran out of money, and those 6 houses didn't pay enough to continue the maintenance on it, and it operated for about 2 years. But everything was still there for it to work. They just didn't have a customer. So anyway, I generally agree with your sentiment that building new dams is a mistake, I think. So there are many that exist. So
yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario. Do you build the energy capacity and then hope people use enough energy, or do you have demand for energy and then build the catch up by building energy generation capacity? And that's the problem that mini grid developers face, which is where Bitcoin mining hardware comes in, because you build a 100 kilowatt mini grid and there's only 1 kilowatt of energy demand on the grid from the consumer to start with before they start requiring energy when they start to have needs to power laptops, mobile phones, etc. In the meantime, what do? Mining hardware is a perfect solution, the interim solution as an energy load in a mini grid to make the economics of such a project work.
I'm actually in line right now, waiting for another 40% of people to fund your Bayesville School of Skills project. So I'm eager to let other people know that my experience again in West Africa was we actually went around and built vocational high schools in parts of West Africa. And one of the biggest problems that and this is 30 years ago, but one of the biggest problems that we had at the time is that we couldn't teach any skill that required power because the power was so unreliable. And
most skills these days are going to require some form of electronics. Even if you're in medicine, you still need access computer systems and tools and machinery.
Yeah, so your idea of microgrids, setting up a bunch of solar panels in different places, hopefully funding them with small Bitcoin installations along the way. I see that as the march of advancement across all of sub-Saharan Africa, one village at a time. And it's inspiring to me. I'm just excited to hear somebody doing it.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Abe.
Okay, no, thank you. Thanks for being involved, and please keep spreading the good word about what we're doing. That's a very worthwhile project, the Bayesville School of Skills, and I really hope that people can get involved and get this project funded.
Thanks again.
Well, we will leave it at that then. If
I can see one, so I can see there's someone called Blueberries in the group who's asked a question, which is how much coal does Europe use when compared to South Africa? Well, I can tell you that the grid generation capacity in South Africa is about 45 gigawatts of coal generation capacity. And I know in the UK, the last coal power station was turned off a few years ago, and there's no more coal power being used in the UK. And only due to the issues in the Ukraine and getting gas have they started to switch back on coal power stations in Germany. But of course, the German grid in the summertime can be at sometimes 100% solar powered. So 100% solar powered. Let that sink in for a moment. So some days in Germany is 100% solar energy powered. So it's and the fact you could deploy solar energy very, very quickly kind of means there's almost no need to start recommissioning and coal power stations in Europe when you can just fill in any gaps with solar. And I do expect that the rate of installation of solar in South Africa, that as the coal power stations are decommissioned in South Africa, that it'll actually be there would be no point in replacing them because solar energy is going to be there filling in the gap.
Fantastic. Piccolo, if you have a quick question, probably squeeze you in.
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quick to what Byron and Epic Cambridge was talking about in terms of hydro, because I guess the way you guys are talking about it is Epic Cambridge is distributed solar, right? Which is cool. And then you have the Nile, which has river current flow. I mean, one thing maybe is, micro hydro for water current turbines that fit in the river. and has sort of cages around it to prevent, nettings to prevent sort of, fish and livestock from getting in there, stuff like that. And maybe that complements like your micro sort of solar projects along like, what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. The only issue with that is that you'd have to be very lucky to be living next to a river. And the only way of getting energy from a river to the load is by building power lines. And then you're back to this kind of centralized energy generation challenge of how do you get energy from where it's being produced to where it's needed. And that's the beauty of solar, is that you could put it anywhere. You don't need cables to connect it to the remote locations, because you could just put the solar panels in that remote location. And as I mentioned earlier in the call, like Africa is suffering from major droughts in a lot of locations, which means that the rivers that you're powering don't even be guaranteed to be running in the future. I mean, there's riverbeds now exposed in a lot of places in China and in Europe because rivers have simply stopped flowing because of extreme heat waves and droughts as a result of climate change. And that's only going to become more pronounced and exaggerated as we go into the future. So hydro is a risk.
Yeah,
you can't be guaranteed the water's there.
Without constant flow, you're right. I can see that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool, guys. Well, there's no further questions. I just want to say thank you very much all for listening in and joining in the conversation. I really encourage you all to sign up to Sun Exchange if you've not done so already. And please, if you want to follow my rantings and ravings on Twitter, give me a follow. I try to keep people up to date with the things that I think are interesting. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you very much for having me speak.
Absolutely, Abe. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Your input was greatly appreciated. And again, everybody visit the sunexchange.com. Very fascinating and doing great work. So thanks again. I appreciate it.
Cool. No problem at all. Hope to speak to you again one day soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for tuning in to The Progressive Bitcoiner. If you enjoyed the show, head on over to Apple Podcasts and please leave a review. And don't forget, we have a website, theprogressivebitcoiner.com, where we have a lot of great content on Bitcoin and progressive issues. Thanks again for tuning in.